I'm Adam McGowan, Director of Industry Development at Australia Council for the Arts, soon to be Creative Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, here in Sydney, where I am so fortunate to live, work and play on these traditional lands. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us for today's session. I also want to acknowledge the many First Nations lands you are all joining from across this beautiful continent. Welcome to the first of our webinar series, Governance Conversations, which we're delighted to be collaborating with Diversity Arts Australia to deliver. Today's discussion about fit-for-purpose governance models will be the first of 6 webinars, and you can find out details about future sessions on our website. Governance Conversations will explore practical aspects of governing arts and creative industries organisations, explore innovative approaches, and share best practice models for ensuring diversity and cultural safety. Thanks to Lena Nahlous, CEO of Diversity Arts Australia, and the entire team. Thanks also to our guest speakers for today, Cecilia Anthony and Kate Larson. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Lena, our host for Governance Conversations. Thanks so much, Lena.
Thanks for that warm introduction, Adam, and for that welcome. I wanted to let people know that this session's being live streamed and recorded and will be available for people to re-watch if they're interested. And also it will be live captioned by Angela Shee and Luke Perry, and Auslan interpreted by Yasmin Dendachi and Terry Richardson. If you're not familiar with Zoom, go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on Show Captions, and you'll be able to turn on those captions. I'm a middle-aged Arab woman. I have light olive skin, dark brown hair with some greys, and I'm currently wearing a cream top and brown rimmed glasses. I'd also like to respectfully acknowledge the First Peoples of these lands and the various Indigenous lands we're all zooming in from and to, and also to acknowledge First Peoples' ongoing connections to sky, sea and land, and the rich diversity of First Nations cultures and communities. I wanted to acknowledge I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my deepest respects to elders past and present and all the First Nations folks here today in our session. Just a gentle reminder about doing our best to create safer spaces at both Diversity Arts and the Australia Council. We work to uphold the practices and principles of creating safer spaces, which, as Dr. Ruth D'Souza points out, isn't something we can always guarantee, but it's something that we always have to strive for. So conversations about change and about doing things differently can be uncomfortable, they can be challenging. So if you need to take a break, you're welcome to do so, step away if you need to, but we do encourage you to also lean into the discomfort as part of this series. And also please make your comments and questions in the chat, as respectful as possible. Now I'd like to say just a few words about Diversity Arts Australia. We're the national voice for ethno-cultural and migrant racial equity in the arts, screen and creative sectors. We do work intersectionally and in partnership with other communities. Our work is guided by a human rights ethic and social justice principles, and we strongly believe that embracing a diverse range of creative expression and participation is essential for fostering democracy, inclusivity, and sustainability in terms of the creative sector and society. It might seem a little bit left of centre that Diversity Arts is working with the Australia Council on this governance series and that we're producing it. But we are so very interested in governance, and the deal is, I guess, that we believe that equity should never be some optional add-on. You can't add on, kind of anti-racism or, accessibility as an afterthought. Equity needs to be at the very heart of solid governance practices and structures. So it can never be retrofitted. You need to build those structures to be inclusive from the beginning. And when you embed equity into your governance approach, you're creating a more robust and resilient model. And it's like giving your organization that extra layer of strength and support. And some of our projects, like our Creative Equity Toolkit website, a fantastic partnership with British Council, kind of really dives deep into topics like governance and organisational culture, two of the main topics on that toolkit, recognising that these topics are key to tackling racism and promoting equity. And of course, there's a lot of practical ways to achieve that outlined in this series and also on that website with our training and capacity building programs like Fair Play. A key part of that is working with organisations to develop equity plans that embed good governance approaches and structures through leadership and organisational culture as well, through employment practices. Our Shifting the Balance report looked at leadership over nearly 2,000 leaders across 200 leading cultural organisations and found that half had no leadership at all from culturally and linguistically diverse background. And the conversations in that report and the case studies presented are also talking about how critical diverse leadership is to good governance and robust organisations. So in today's session, we're going to dig into the core purpose of governance to understand how the arts and creative sectors can manage risk, resources, equity and power sharing through fit-for-purpose governance models. So we'll talk about innovative and equitable frameworks that are both flexible but also, uphold our responsibilities and ensure we're accountable as directors. The structure of today will be that I'll invite each of our wonderful guests to speak for 10 minutes each. Then I'll ask them some questions, and we'll also be showing you some video case studies along the way. We're hoping that we're going to have 10 minutes for discussion at the end. So don't wait till the end. If you have any questions that you'd like to pose to the speakers, please pop them into the, not into the chat, but into the, sorry, I'm forgetting the word, the Q&A, sorry, yes, just pop them into the Q&A. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Cecilia Anthony, who is the outgoing General Manager Advisory at Inside Policy, a First Nations-led business. Cecilia has over 30 years of board experience and has worked on employment, cultural and justice issues across government, community and business sectors. Cecilia serves on the boards of Titus in Business and Yillabara Employment Services, and also on our board at Diversity Arts Australia. So over to Cecilia now to speak a little bit about how we've inherited these governance structures in Australia and other things.
Thanks, Lena. Yama, everyone. For my descriptor, I'd like to say that I started on boards when I was a fetus, but the reality is I am a middle-aged woman. I'm a biracial woman of colour. From an Arabic background, I have dark hair, fair skin. I've got black-rimmed glasses on today, and I've got surprisingly a little bit of multicolour. I'm usually all in black. Thank you for having me. I've been sitting on governance boards and structures literally since I was a teenager, and I have specialised in my career working with and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and in that sort of multi-policy sector. But I've also spent some time working with migrant and humanitarian communities and sort of some of my own communities as well. And I'm passionate about recognising that the institutions and the structures that we have in Australia were never meant to be fit for purpose for a colonised nation that was built on the top of stolen First Nations lands, and that evolved very quickly into a migrant multicultural nation. So what I want to do this morning is, for the next 10 minutes or so, take us back to basics to understand what governance is, how what we understand governance today developed, and look at the culture behind governance. So let's start with defining governance. Governance is generally a concept with a number of different interconnected and nuanced elements. And excuse me for what I'm about to say, because I always put myself straight into the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, but the word governance comes from the Greek. It comes from the work of the philosopher Plato, and it literally means to steer. And the way that Plato first started defining governance was very much about steering men. So from the very point of definition, there was a gendered lens on governance. And that is not something that necessarily has changed over the millennia. The Collins English Dictionary definition of governance contains two elements, and that's an important insight into what we understand as governance. So one element is government control or authority, and the second is the action, manner, or system of governing. And that's important to understand because CAPER, which is the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research at ANU, among many others, has noted that governance often bears the meanings associated with Western ideas of what constitutes good governance by nation states. So we start to merge the concepts of government and governance together. But in practicality, while governments are an important part of governance, governance means so much more than just government. Fundamentally, governance is about power, relationships, and processes of representation and accountability. It's about who has influence, who makes decisions, and how decision makers are held to account. Governance encompasses all of the aspects of running a society or a group within a society, including the formal and informal institutions through which the group, the community, the society makes decisions, distributes and exercises authority and power, determines strategic goals, and this is probably all starting to sound very familiar to you all, organises corporate, group and individual behaviour, develops rules and assigns responsibility. So when we start to think about what we are talking about and what we understand governance in the concept of arts and cultural organisations, we're starting to talk about the narrower term of corporate governance, which kind of originated in the 1920s. And it originated to describe the management, decision-making and accountability structures of private corporations, and particularly those with shareholder interests. So it was very much grew out of and was defined by making money and who had power and authority and control. The OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, defines this narrower term of corporate governance as procedures and processes according to which an organisation is directed and controlled. The corporate governance structure specifies the distribution of rights and responsibilities among different participants in the organisation, such as the board, managers, shareholders or members, and other stakeholders. And it lays down the rules and procedures for decision making. And corporate governance includes all things like appropriate reporting and accounting, system, board roles and requirements, disclosure, sorry, I always stumble over that word, disclosure requirements, transparent decision making and dispute resolution procedures. Very practical, it's very procedural. The first recorded big debate on corporate governance arose in 1602 in the Netherlands, which unsurprisingly the oldest stock market in the world is based. And it was, again, very much about men and money. The more modern origins of corporate governance began to appear in the US in the early 19th century around very early business enterprises. However, some people believe that the initial beginnings of corporate governance might have come from Adam Smith's thesis in his book, The Wealth of Nations, 3 centuries ago. And anyone who did high school or first year economics at uni will remember Adam Smith. And he warned of potential problems of corporate absent ownership when he raised issues of the separation between ownership and stewardship. And again, it was about joint stock corporations and who could control or look after other people's money and do it with good care and good watch, and whether a manager could do that. And inevitably, he called out that there was a need for effective mechanisms to resolve conflicts of interest. In contemporary times, it's really over the last 30 years that there's been a greatly increased interest in corporate governance. And even though its historic roots had not been applied directly, nor did it have a special name or even applicable specific laws or legislations, we can see that corporate governance principles have had implicit presence and roots way back in the history of liberal Western democratic systems. And so corporate governance has become a source of interest for many countries in the world as a weapon that can be used to mitigate or reduce a crisis when it occurs on one hand, and as a building block for companies or organisations on the other hand, in order to create a competitive advantage or maximise their value or enhance their performance. So the next question I want to pose is, what is governance? And over the years, it's been used generically, and it's been used as a concept that's evolved to encompass relationships between stakeholders in a whole variety of setups. In the present day, the term means different things in different contexts, and the use of an adjective with the word governance has become almost mandatory to make any sense of it at all. And the most common one you'll be familiar with is good governance. But at its most basic, governance is simply a control regime that can be understood to have three main components. The first one is a set of institutions. The second one is a set of norms. And the third is a set of practices, which is the practical how to interact between the institutions and the norms. Control norms may be legal in a strict sense, we'll call that hard law, or in a broader sense, and we'll call that soft law. Hard law controls include formal legal and regulatory frameworks and responsibilities. Soft law examples are things like principles of good governance or conventions or expectations around behaviour that are not deemed, in a legal framework. And the framework of a governance system, as you'll all be familiar with, is a constitution, which performs two main functions: to establish and maintain a system of power, and to regulate and control administrative power by the imposition of boundaries and limits. And in a sense, these are really the two sides of the governance coin. Governance is not something that belongs to one group of people, and nor is it specific or unique to Western cultures and their structures. Again, Caper at ANU outlined a number of commonalities in the way governance is understood in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And for me, these commonalities are also relevant to a lot of culturally and linguistically diverse communities in Australia. And these commonalities include consideration of critical institutional spheres, the state, the market, the hierarchy, the community, as being interconnected with each other and not separate as they can be seen in a Western sense. There's a focus on a wider field of players and relationships and not simply on government. There's the idea of some form of cooperation and coordination as fundamental to effectiveness. There's an attention given to concrete systems of action, decision-making and accountability, and the foregrounding of power, control and choice. There's the idea that governance effectiveness can be evaluated against benchmarks and principles, and a growing recognition that governance and evaluations of its effectiveness are the products of culturally based systems.
Cecilia, sorry to interrupt. It's Lena. You've got
Have I gone
about,
on too long?
you can maybe round it up in a minute if that's okay. We can come back to this.
I'm almost there.
Okay.
No, I'm almost there. So, so the outshot is all societies or all groups are governed in some way, and that culture defines that how that structure is developed. And there are features of what we understand as governance in Australia that are really similar to governance in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and culturally and linguistically diverse communities, but there are really distinct differences. And those differences are around complexity of social and political systems, systems that are fluid and negotiable, systems that are based in collaboration and consensus, and that relationships and shared connections are the foundations of the group or the network. We have to have governance systems that align with the culture of the people that they're designed to represent. And unless we do, we are shutting out large sections of our community from effective organisational governance in any sort of sector. And today we're talking about arts and cultural sector. And I'll just finish with the quote that Mick Dodson and Diane Smith used when they were talking about how to, explaining how a successful Indigenous organisation blends community governance requirements with the broader governance environment. And they said, cultural match is not simply a matter of importing romanticised views of traditional Indigenous structures or authority and expecting them to handle economic development decisions, financial accounts and daily business management. Creating a cultural match is more about developing strategic and realistic connections between cultural values and standards and those required by the world of business and administration. And that for me sums up exactly what we're talking about today, the marrying of two systems to create something that is fit for purpose. Back to you, Lena.
Oh, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I don't know how you managed it, but you did. You did this incredibly succinct kind of history of governance and then also brought it back to the Australian context and to First Nations, Indigenous kind of knowledge and culturally diverse knowledge as well. And yeah, and I like that you kind of ended on, you know, bringing it back to the fact that whatever systems we have, they need to actually align with the people who they represent. So thank you so much, Cecilia. We'll hear more about some of those ideas. We'll unpack them more as we go. But now I would like to introduce Kate Larson, who is a very experienced writer and arts cultural consultant with over 20 years of diverse expertise across non-profit, government and cultural sectors in Australia, Asia and the United Kingdom. Kate's recognised as a leading authority in arts, governance, cultural leadership, workplace culture and wellbeing. And Kate's work fosters inclusive communities and amplifies underrepresented voices. So Kate's going to talk a little bit about her work and research as it relates to new models and innovations in governance. So over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Lena, and hello, everyone. It's great to see so many wonderful known names and some new names in the attendees today. And I know this video is going to be recorded and go a lot further as well. I am, as always, never more aware than when we come together, even digitally, to talk about culture, that we do so here in what we now know as Australia, on the land of the oldest living continuing culture in the world. In my case today, the unceded land of the Kulin Nation. And just that's nothing short of extraordinary and an extraordinary privilege to share with you all. I am a middle-aged white woman with short dark hair and dark-rimmed glasses and dangly red earrings. And I just want to, before I get stuck in, I just wanted to acknowledge that post-pandemic, and for those on the phone, I definitely put post in inverted commas then, because we are still in the midst of feeling the impact of living through COVID-19 and living with COVID-19. But in this new normal, or whichever new we're up to these days, we are deep in the middle of sector-wide exhaustion and burnout, which has brought with it this new sense of perspective, I think, that we are no longer willing to put up with the way things have always been done, the models that were not designed for us that Cecilia just explained, which includes the way that we govern our organisations and the way that we are governed by them. I think it's important to acknowledge, though, that for the time being, our entire arts governance model is built on institutionalised and mandated generosity, which makes it very hard to have these conversations, to critique it without appearing to critique the people within it. So please take all of our, and certainly my respect for board, committee and council members as read, and know that though I genuinely believe that our boards and board members are failing, and we have the data now to back that up, I also believe that it's because we're being set up to do so by governance models and learn practice that aren't fit for purpose. I am, as Lena was saying, an independent researcher, consultant and writer, and in the last several years I've been working on articulating the different ways in which our sector is broken, from governance models to workforce crises, and most recently our funding and peer assessment systems, as well as how we can make the best of the broken systems that we've got and how we can work together to improve or change them in the future. And I just wanted to mention 3 key issues or trends that have come up in that research. So first, I guess, is that like many other under-resourced sectors that are staffed by its biggest fans, our sector has always relied on the willingness of passionate individuals to sacrifice our well-being, certainly our financial well-being, but often our emotional well-being, our health, our relationships, for the sake of the show must go on, or for the sake of just simply thinking that's the price of working in an area that we love or believe in desperately. Unfortunately, over the last impossible years, when most organisations needed more from our governors, we saw many step back instead of stepping up, which is completely understandable on one hand, because it's been, as I said, an impossible time, and board members haven't been at our best selves either. But our legal and ethical duty of care is actually enhanced during times of crisis, not diminished. And because that hasn't happened, it's meant we've seen former best practice workplaces deteriorating and disturbing new trends, like boards asking more of their CEOs and teams at a time when everybody's capacity is lower, more micromanagement, more microaggressions, more surveillance, even though the data shows us that we were more productive when we were working from home or working flexibly, loss of relationships, particularly between boards and their leaders, with disturbing, terrifying trend actually of a huge number of leaders not only leaving their jobs, but leaving the sector entirely, and obviously not being replaced at the same rate because of the rising cost of arts and humanities education, and a huge loss of trust between governors and operational practitioners, which is going to take time to rebuild. In fact, my research, my ongoing research into arts governance in Australia has showed that only 19% of board and committee members were seen to be currently contributing to a positive and productive board and workplace culture most of the time, which really makes that duty of care piece the pointiest end of our work right now. Secondly, because our organisations at the moment are legally not allowed to exist without boards, governance underpins absolutely everything that we do, which makes it both one of the most important, but also one of the most overlooked areas of our work, in that we are so busy doing it, we barely have time to articulate the issues, let alone do anything about them, find the time or the resources we need to change them. As I said, these days we actually have quite a body of research that speaks to boards' poor track record in nearly every single one of the areas that we're tasked with, which we know is a significant and disparate workload that includes all the things: oversight, compliance, strategic direction, stewardship, duty of care, financial sustainability, often direct fundraising, risk management, capacity building, change management, crisis management recently, and being ambassadors for their organizations, and often lots more. Which tells us, I think, that even when they're working well, our boards are usually much harder work than either board or staff members would like, and that it doesn't take much to realize that expecting volunteers to have the skills and time to meet those incredibly far-reaching obligations is not only unreasonable, but also unfair in that it's setting us up to fail. And it's actually, and this has been the key point of my recent research and writing, actually unnecessary, in that most of that list is either learned or self-imposed or funder-imposed expectations that are not required by law. So I think that a lot of the confusions, most of our governance issues start with this, with exactly that confusion between what board members want or think they need to do, or even what they've been taught they need to do or learned from being on a board, what the legislation technically requires of us, and what our organizations actually need. But if we simply work out what we have to do, we find there's much less risk and much more room for innovation than we've been taught in anything from the number of board members we're required to have. The maximum of any state or territory jurisdiction in Australia is 5, much smaller than most of us have been taught over our careers. Number of type of office holders, number of type of meetings, how we conduct our businesses, again, come from white military colonial structures, and even the structure and hierarchy of our governance and operations teams are all a lot more flexible than we've been led to believe. The last point I wanted to make is that these issues are becoming more urgent. This is not an academic exercise. We're not muddling through, okay, volunteerism was decreasing even before the pandemic. Bad arts boards making big news headlines over the last few years have made governance an even less attractive option, as has our current workforce issues, exhaustion, and this new perspective, as well as our challenging and increasingly changing and complex operating environments. Now more than ever, our organizations simply do not have the capacity to support the perpetual cycle of governance training that's clearly not working, or address the issues that poor governance can leave in its wake. So we need to fix the system that requires us to have boards before we run out of board members to fill them, which means I think we need to train ourselves to think beyond boards, which I'm really excited to have a discussion about today, because surely if everything else in the world is changing, our governance needs to change too.
Thank you so much for that, Kate. I feel like we've gone now all the way from ancient Greece with Cecilia to a really good snapshot of what our sector's kind of gone through, I guess, long term, but also has been exacerbated and, become more acute as a result of the pandemic. And I love that, kind of call to kind of fix governance systems before we, kind of bringing on more people, setting up more boards and kind of setting them up to fail with systems that just aren't fit for our sector, that aren't kind of made for us. And I know that we're going to hear a little bit more about that very soon. I'm going to ask you a few questions, but first I'm going to show a video, because I think part of we wanted to show these videos to also kind of give you some inspiration and have some thought about, like as mini case studies about what organisations are doing on their governance journeys, because part of the big governance issue in Australia is that we're often talking about best practice, but usually it's learned practice. And our conversations around governance in the creative sector here are pretty new, and they're just starting. So these case studies are intended not to say this is best practice, but this is part of a journey, and these organisations have generously shared part of their story and their journey and their work with us. So the first case study is from Black Dance in Brisbane, and you'll hear from co-CEO and executive producer Marinda Donnelly and co-CEO business director Kate Eltham. So can the OzCo please play the video?
My name is Marinda Donnelly and I am a proud Wiradjuri woman. I was born in Forbes and raised off country in Tinga in northwest New South Wales on Kamilaroi country, and I'm dialing in today from the homelands of the Turrbal and the Yagara, whose elders I pay respect to for the continuous custodianship and caretakering of this country for over 3,000 generations. Black Dance is the national producing and advocacy and industry organisation for First Nations dancers and choreographers in Australia.
Black Dance is a company limited by guarantee. So we have a company structure reporting under the Corporations Act, but also we're a registered charity. So our main regulator is the Australian Charities and Non-Profits Commission. We have some conventional governance structures, and we also have some First Nations specific governance structures that are specifically designed and in place to support our values, principles, and uphold our cultural obligations as a self-determined First Nations organisation. So that includes, on the standard side, we have a board of directors. Under the Black Dance Constitution, you must be a First Nations person to be a member of Black Dance. You don't have to be a First Nations person to be a company director. However, we operate under the principle that we should at all times be a First Nations led and governed organisation, and therefore at all times our board is majority First Nations. In addition to that, Black Dance has some other governance structures that we use to support that that cultural governance as part of our overlay.
So since our inception in 2005, and we were founded by Marilyn Miller at that time, Black Dance has always had, out of necessity and in upholding our principles, a cultural advisory group of some sort.
We have a range of remuneration structures in place for our governance arrangement. Our board of directors, our company directors, are not paid. Our constitution expressly forbids that directors are paid for their time as part of serving on the Black Dance board. However, our Cultural Council members do receive remuneration, and the remuneration is reviewed as part of the terms of reference for the Cultural Council, which is approved by the board and reviewed every 2 years. A really important concept for Black Dance is that governance is a verb. It's something we do. It isn't just a structure. And when we say the word governance, we aren't only referring to our board and to the statutory or legislative framework that we operate under. We are thinking perhaps about some higher principles and values around cultural governance, and that infuses everything that we do on a day-to-day basis in the way that we work and the way that we organise ourselves. And that includes how we engage with other entities and institutions as well.
For example, that actually can become a requirement for us at Black Dance as to why and how we partner with another organisation, because that Indigenous governance is an overlay to everything that we do. It makes sense that sometimes our partners within the ecology, and being a national organisation, we need to know that there is Indigenous governance happening in the organisations that we partner with as well. And that's for reasons such as cultural safety, cultural protocols, that there's a degree of cultural competence, and all of this can be understood as cultural equity.
Hi. Thanks so much to Marinda Donnelly and Kate Elsom from Black Dance for sharing this knowledge and a little bit about the journey of your company with us. And I love that governance is a verb and it's something that you do. And I'm going to turn to our first kind of topic area, which is a little bit about continuing from some of the points raised by Kate and Cecilia about, you know, what governance is in an arts and cultural context. And following on from that video, it was really interesting to see how Black Dance had tailored their governance structures so that they could ensure that there was First Nations leadership and also that First Nations knowledge was embedded into that structure. And they talk about company directors not being paid, but council members being paid. And given, Kate, what you were saying about, you know, how much we expect of often volunteer boards in the sector, what is the truth, Kate, about paying board members on arts boards in Australia? Because we're often told that we can't pay our board members, but we know that in most other industries, board members are paid and often quite well. So throwing this to you, Kate, to kick off.
Thanks, Lena. The situation, the truth, I guess, is complex and changing. So, as I said, we're governed, our organisations are governed in the arts and cultural sector by a range of different legislations, but most of them require that mandated generosity. So most of the incorporated association legislation, for example, which differ slightly from state to state, but are quite similar, and the not-for-profit requirements of organisations, companies registered under the Federal Corporations Act, do specify that that board members shouldn't receive sitting fees, only receive payment for specific services delivered in good faith. Other arts and cultural legislation does not have that requirement. So most of the state and federal statutory authorities or public-owned companies, for example, that are ministerially appointed, do pay their board members. Some of them pay their board members more than an average Australian artist earns in a full year for just those few meetings. And some other models, so Aboriginal incorporations, for example, also have capacity within their legislation to pay board members, which some choose to do and some don't. So it's a really complex legislative space, and I'm sure Cecilia knows more about the legal side, ins and outs of that than I do. But where I'm really interested is in the innovation that are happening on two parts of that. So one, there's been a real groundswell of innovation and action based on kind of equity frameworks coming from, well, firstly from Theatre Network Australia, who introduced an independent artist sitting fee policy, a similar version of which has since been adopted and is being advocated for by the National Association for Visual Arts, NAVA, across the country. So both organisations have created frameworks that say, in spite of our legislation, we recognise that in order to be able to address the financial barriers that actually cost some people to be on our governing boards, people who aren't representing an organisation, people who have caring responsibilities and can't afford the daycare, people who live further away from geographically situated board meetings. It's those policies, and I recommend looking at Theatre Network Australia and the NAVA website because they're freely available resources, allow organisations to use that equity approach to say, we are going to pay sitting fees to make this an equal playing field. We might, it might be a case to do it for independent artists and practitioners, or for, we recognise we're coming from a deficit position in terms of representing the community we're supposed to be part of, and so we'll pay people who come from First Nations communities or culturally diverse communities or whatever that organisation decides. So that's really exciting, and funding bodies are starting to, if not wave pom-poms in excitement at that idea are starting to be on board with it, because we're getting more practice and more practice examples happening. And also that money does not have to necessarily come from public funding. So it can come from other areas of your income. The other thing, which we'll talk more about in the second question, is that we're starting to think about governance as not being a direct correlation with our boards. So, but governance as a broader governance ecology, as of our decision makers, the people who influence, the people who guide and steer and support the organization. So if we stop thinking about governors as just those people on those boards and whether we can or cannot get around the legislation to fund them, and think about, like in the Black Dance model, cultural councils, advisory councils, consensus conferences, other ways of bringing people in and pay them, then there's no legislative barrier at all.
Thanks so much for that, Kate. Cecilia, I am going to go to the next question, but if you wanted to add anything about payment and the truth about payment, although then I might get you to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one quick statement. I think for me, it's always struck me in the arts and cultural sectors that there's a class aspect to payment or non-payment of people involved in organisational governance, and that this is a space where the wealthy traditionally would, by their own largesse, give their time voluntarily. And I think that that's something that has kind of stuck, and it does exclude a lot of people. And so you do end up with that sort of sameness of people sitting on boards and sitting in positions of power and influence over arts organisations, and that's something that's got to be front of mind, I think, if it isn't already.
I think that's a really important point, and generally governance structures can also be really kind of in a class-based way, be really inaccessible and lock people out, not just in terms of capacity to give time, but also in terms of language and rules and regulations. Cecilia, if we're really looking at embracing new and alternative ways of doing things, and you talked a bit about incorporating First Nations and migrant cultural knowledges into the way that we run organisations or governance structures, not actually being set up with that in mind, and kind of coming, as both you and Kate have spoken about, coming from kind of models that are not from here, not from this land, and not intended to be kind of applied to this context. What governance structures and regulations and legalities do we absolutely need to be compliant with if we're, but also, if we're seeking to kind of, this is a very rambly version of the question, apologies, I might so okay. if we want to embrace new and alternative ways of doing things, and we know that we do, what do we still need to keep? What do we need to, kind of still continue to conform to in terms of, legalities and regulations and structures, and what can we leave behind in order to do that? Yeah.
I think where we are at the moment, it's not a case of what can we leave behind, because I think we're still very much at the start of this conversation and this shift. So I think it is about needing to adhere to the current regulatory and legislative framework that governance operates in, but looking at how to marry what is fit for purpose for the communities that these organisations are here to serve or to contribute to. And there's a lot of really good examples in the native title space with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander PBCs, prescribed body corporates that you've got to have to make a native title claim. And there's something called two-way governance. And so the Yaru's public PBC organisation in Broome in WA, which is their native title sort of authority, has got a governance structure, a representative structure, where they've got half of the board are what they call designated leaders. And so they are leaders within Yaru who are accepted by the community as having authority. And then the other half of the board are elected every 2 years, and they have a certain number of turnover positions in the elected space to make sure that there is some turnover of the board every 2 years. And so they've taken traditional structure and a Western structure and married them together, which works really well. So I think it's about adding to, at this point, I would like down the track for us to be, talking about a discussion around the regulatory and the legal frameworks for organisations in Australia, because, and you made a point about language, that there is so much that is impenetrable, as with a lot of our institutions and legal structures, because they were historically designed by certain class and type of man for men just like them. And so the language of governance in Australia is exclusionary, even for women. And I as a young woman on my first board, I don't think I said a word for a year. It took all my effort just to follow what the hell was going on in the room until I learnt to, read the regulations and all that paperwork that actually gave you the tools and the methods. It excludes women, it excludes First Nations people, people from migrant backgrounds, people with lived experience of disability, young people. And you do get some examples, and I think you've got one later, of where particularly young people or organisations run for and by young people will just kind of do their own thing because they need to make it work for themselves. And I think that's what we're talking about. It's about doing something that is fit for purpose and not trying to fit square peg round hole all the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Kate, I might ask you that same question if you wanted to add anything to that as well, to that question. And I know that you also wanted to add something about payment. So I might hand over to you. Yeah.
Thanks, Lena. I think just following on from that question, I think one of the strange and kind of wonderful things that's happening at the moment is that organizations across the country are finally catching up, thanks in no small part to national policy directions, but also grassroots advocacy, with the idea that arts governance in Australia is white, cis, non-disabled monoculture mainly, and that's not good anymore, which is great. We're glad we're at the point of acknowledging that, but it means that a lot of organizations are panicking, and because most of us are coming from such a deficit position, it means people from those communities are being asked to do more often, and by more organizations, often for free than before. So we're calling on First Nations artists and artists of color and disabled artists and everybody who has not been previously represented. There's kind of this backlog of requests, which is, as I said, wonderful on the one hand, but not if it's not recognizing that labor. And there's perhaps also a need to think about different ways of getting that advice from, in some cases, quite limited pools. So, and make sure that that wisdom is being respected and compensated appropriately. So I think that we're going to see more developments in that space as we adjust to a new normal. And just on that payment issue, just one last thing I wanted to add is that in no way, in advocating for unpaid board members, advocating for the importance of that and value of that cultural labor, and sharing models in which we could be compensating our board members, in no way is that saying that that's the solution to all of our problems. In fact, in a model where we just say, okay, we're going to address inequities by starting to pay our board members, we'll actually create more inequities when we think about how significantly underpaid our sector is compared to other parts of the not-for-profit sector. So if organizations make the decision to just redivert some of our limited and increasingly difficult to get funds towards our board members at the expense of paying our artists the living wage or bringing our arts managers up to standard, that's certainly not the solution that anybody's looking for. So it is a complex issue. We're just I think what's exciting is that we're starting to see more flexibility in the different elements that we can throw into the mix to increase that equity position and that recognition of what's been traditionally completely hidden, taken for granted labour.
Thanks so much, Kate. And given that there is great inequity in terms of, areas like culturally diverse leadership or disabled leadership on boards, then it would just introducing payment without actually redesigning the structures and dealing with inequity in the sector would, like you said, also just further entrench that inequity in my view. I'm going to now ask the Australia Council to play a video, another case study, this time from Western Edge, a youth-based company in Melbourne, and we're going to hear from Penny Harpham, who is the CEO and Executive Director.
I'm the CEO of Western Edge, formerly known as Western Edge Youth Arts, but rebranded by the young people in our organisation as Western Edge. It's a not-for-profit youth arts organisation that works all across Melbourne's western suburbs, primary schools, high schools, community centres and settings, a professional development program, and we also make professional productions. So Western Edge began almost 30 years ago now, in the mid-90s. There was a group of people working in schools in the western suburbs and a group of people working in communities. And they were working at a Footscray Community Arts Centre, and they kind of were like, why don't we do this together? So for about a decade, that group of people continued to work in that way, and then they incorporated in the mid-2000s, 2005. So obviously for a while there wasn't a board, there was just a group of people working, and then when they incorporated, a board came along. That board was full of passionate people working in the company for many, many years. However, the board was predominantly white. In fact, it was all white. And considering our organisation works all across the western suburbs, which is one of the most multicultural areas in the country, there's over 130 language groups. Over 50% of people speak English, a language other than English at home. I started in the company 8 years ago, actually. It's my 8th year. And I started as an artist in the company. And so while I was there, there was board change going on by the previous CEO. And that was really exciting because actually a very diverse board was welcomed in. There were 2 young people under 30, young people of colour, one who'd even come through the programs themselves in the western suburbs, and a really diverse group of cultural representation. And that was fantastic. That was the board that in 2019, when Tarua Mavondo, my dear friend, actor, artist, poet, leader, she and I became co-artistic directors and then co-CEOs. So that was the board we inherited. And that was a really wonderful board to work with for so many reasons. They got it. They really got the challenges that our young people were going through because there were 2 people on the board who had those same challenges. That was their lived experience, and many others who weren't young but had had that same experience in their life. So in a sense, we were able to fast track a lot of big cultural and structural change within the organisation because we had board members who were on the level of the major stakeholders, the young people of the western suburbs. However, that board, while personally and structurally and kind of emotionally supportive, all of those kinds of things were great, we didn't have a kind of governance structure. We didn't have like a culture within the board to make everyone kind of as effective and to make people, I guess, feel like they knew exactly how to contribute in a really positive and meaningful way. And I noticed that. I worked with that board for about 3 years and I really noticed so much potential, but also seeing the actual need for interrogation into what a board does in the small to medium profit arts sector or in the arts sector to make these incredible individuals be able to really, like, for lack of better analogy, like take the baton and run with it. Also cultural competency and cultural safety within our board. I think we did really well, but there wasn't any sort of kind of policy or induction process or real kind of cultural safety understanding that was embedded in it. That was something we were like, the board was learning through each other as they went along. So last year in 2022, many of the board members' term was up. And so we were able to do a succession plan for the board, which actually was really exciting. Like you probably hear like horror stories, but it's actually like it was a lot of work, but it was a really lovely time talking to certain board members about what was needed. Young board members on the previous board had said, loved being in it, have loved working in the company, but we would have loved to have been able to do more. We would have loved to known what to do on the board, to have been supported in that way. So, Tarua and I had created our dream list for the board, and of course, very high up was Veronica Pardo, And so I spent 6 months trying to get Veronica Pardo, like I was so nervous, to be on the board. And to my delight, she agreed to become the new chair. There's also so much about board governance we're discovering is like not even true. Like there's so much bureaucracy, there's so much going on that actually weighs down boards and stops them from being dynamic and effective and flexible, which is everything our sector should and needs to be.
Thank you so much to Penny Harper and Western Edge for that case study, and for sharing again that journey, their governance journey. Then we're going to turn ourselves now, or turn the conversation now for the next 20 minutes to think about alternative models and, you know, possible alternative structures. And I might start with Cecilia for this question. And thanks everyone who's been contributing to the Q&A, by the way, and those of you who've been already answering and responding to people. That's thank you, Cecilia and Kate, for that. So Cecilia, what are some alternative models? You've already mentioned some, or potential governance structures that we could consider in our sector, in the arts and cultural sector, that you've come across?
Oh, absolutely. I mentioned 2A governance, which has grown out of the native title area. And another example is the Eastern Maar Aboriginal Corporation in Victoria. And they represent quite a diverse set of First Nations peoples in their region. And they invested quite a lot of time, first in building capacity among community members to understand Western governance, and then to sit down and come up with models for themselves that are true to traditional practices that resonate with their members and with the people who end up sitting on their board, to basically to make sense of it all, I guess. There's quite a long-term place-based project that's run out of Harvard University and University of Arizona, called the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, and Jumbunna, the Indigenous Research Unit at UTS, have been part of the First Nations nation building project for about 10 years with them. And they, through their very long-term work now, developed a set of conditions under which sustained self-determined development can be achieved at the nation level. And when I say nation, I mean First Nations level, which I think is worth keeping in mind when you're thinking about governance. And it's a series of things that matter. And they say that the conditions that matter are sovereignty. So when groups make their own decisions about what approaches they take, they consistently outperform external decision makers. That institutions matter. Governance has to be backed by capable institutions. And to do this, you need to adopt stable decision-making rules, establish fair and independent mechanisms for dispute resolution, and separate politics from day-to-day business and program management, service delivery. That culture matters. And this very much rings true from the Indigenous perspective in Australia, that Indigenous societies are diverse, and we have more than 360 and 500 First Nations and 500 language groups just in Australia. But that each nation has to equip itself with its own governing structure and system and policies and procedures that fits its own culture. And finally, that leadership matters, and good governance requires leaders who introduce new knowledge and experiences, who challenge assumptions and who propose change. And such leaders, whether they're elected, they're community leaders or spiritual leaders, can bring people with them on a journey where things can be different and inspire them to take action. And I think that's a really important foundational set for anyone to consider when they're looking at their governance structures. Black Dance is another great example. The advisory committee, the cultural advisory committee, my only warning there for non-Indigenous arts organisations is that you don't tokenize people onto an cultural advisory committee and not have a cross flow of movement onto your representative board as the decision-making body, so that you don't pigeonhole First Nations people or culturally and linguistically diverse people, people with disability, young people, into this side advisory committee that doesn't actually have ultimate decision-making powers, would be my only word of warning there.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for that. And that makes me think about, and I don't know if it's still there, but I assume it is, at Footscray Community Arts Centre, where they have their Elders, First Nations Elders Council. And my understanding was that everything needed to be approved. Any Indigenous kind of projects or work needed to be approved by that Elders Council to go ahead, and that had been embedded into the Constitution. So I think, yeah, what you're saying is very true about not siloing people and tokenizing them in that way, but they need to also have that direct kind of channel to the board to have, yeah, really good food for thought there. Kate, you've worked with Punctum directly, and so is there anything that you wanted to comment about that case study, or not, or to give other examples of alternative models that you've come across through your research that you think would work for arts organisations here?
Yes, I've been lucky to work with Western Edge, who we just heard from on Punctum.
Oh, did I say Punctum by mistake? I'm so sorry. That's the next case study. Apologies.
And Western Edge in particular, I think, are doing some really exciting things, and really taking a really kind of reassuring approach, because, you know, even the Australia Council's recent Spotlight report, 2010 report into governance issues, listed a whole list of areas of things that are going wrong in arts governance in Australia. My research has been coming back with very similar results, and that can all feel really overwhelming. I think we all acknowledge that the problems are there, but we don't know, especially right now with lower capacities, don't know where to start. And I think Western Edge are providing a really nice example in that you don't have to solve everything at once. You know, they're doing some really beautiful work around decolonizing their meeting structures, for example, and taking their meetings to where the people that they need to be involved in their decision making are. So not trying to get one or two young people to come into board meetings into that very white parliamentary Robert Rules of Order motions and seconding, which is not really accessible or interesting to anyone, but taking those meetings to the young people and recording their thoughts and input in a different way. So I think that's really inspiring way of just taking a small aspect of governance and immediately making it more accessible at no cost, and that's not just more accessible but enjoyable and effective for everybody. And I just wanted to hark back to that difference that we can find when we work out what we technically have to do and the difference between that and what we've kind of learnt that we should do, that difference between model rules and actual rules, for example. And this is not just happening in Australia. Organisations all over the world are starting to experiment with that idea. So if the legislation says we need 3 people to do just these few compliance things, they're putting in place a micro or minimally viable board to do that, and thinking more broadly, kind of a pick and mix approach to what their specific organisation needs from its broader governance ecology, which allows us to start training ourselves to think about governance beyond boards and come up with emergent or cutting edge models that actually respond to our organization's needs and kind of walk the talk of our values, right? So how can we say that we have brave or innovative or transformative principles that all of us have in our strategic plans if our governance processes not only look exactly the same as they did 10 years ago, but exactly the same as everybody else's. So some of the models, I guess, that are coming out of that are different groups for different purposes. Again, the whole point of this is to make things easier, not harder. So it's not about giving us more to do. It's thinking about the best way to do things. So for some people, that might be an advisory group alongside a minimally viable board, or a consensus conference. So bringing people together once a year, like we do anyway with our annual general meetings, but asking them actual questions about the organizations and getting them involved in the decision making rather than just ticking some boxes. Another model that's happening is outsourcing. We already outsource some of our governance compliance through our annual financial audits. There's professional secretariat services also exist. So there's no reason why we can't be doing those things that are then just overseen by a minimally viable something. And we're also starting to see globally, at least, some innovation in funding organizations, because obviously funders' expectations of what good governance look like are hugely influential in this space. And the Canada Council, for example, has started making it possible for unincorporated informal organizations and groups that don't have boards to now apply for and successfully receive public funding, in recognition that the board model is not the only model to give you all the accountability that we need.
Thanks so much, Kate. That's really exciting. It's some really great ideas there. I like the idea of outsourcing a lot of our governance work, but also that funding is going to be more open and more accessible, not only to incorporated people within incorporated associations context. I'm just wondering, if we're talking about all of this change, what is the appetite for that change in the sector? You mentioned the word overwhelm, Kate, which I can totally identify with when it comes to governance quite often, and I'm sure a lot of people listening can as well. Cecilia, I might start with you and then throw to Kate about what you think the appetite is for change in the arts and cultural sectors. Well, that's a big one. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm trying to be diplomatic, which is not my usual go-to position, to be honest. I think that there are some people in some organisations who are totally up for this, and who are probably already on their path. But I think that there are others for whom this is ultimately going to be imposed upon them out of the work the Australia Council has been doing over a number of years now, out of the research that Diversity Arts does that's influencing the Australia Council, and the fact that this new Albanese Labor government and Tony, the minister, are gunning for change as well. So ultimately, I think it's inevitably going to be imposed upon those arts organisations who haven't got on board. So my best advice would be get on with it.
Thanks. That was pretty...
Was that diplomatic enough?
It was diplomatic enough, definitely,
Okay.
definitely. So, Kate.
I'm possibly going to be less diplomatic. We'll see. I think at practitioner level, arts leader, arts manager, artists, organisation based, the appetite is huge. As usual, the heavy lifting is really being done by the small to medium sector. That's where we're seeing the innovation. That's where we're seeing, unfortunately, the people with the least resources to spare taking up this challenge for the benefit of the whole sector. The further in my research and my work with organisations, the further up the food chain you get, the more resistance there is. And I guess that's unsurprising when people have a vested interest in receiving quite significant fees for being a board member. Also, I think there's a cultural difference in being appointed to a board by a government than opting and seeking out a board appointment for something that you have already got a direct connection to. So that is, I think the appetite is slower to develop, but we are in Australia quite far behind in this conversation compared to some of our international compatriots. Canada, as I mentioned, has got to the point where its national arts body is doing things significantly differently in terms of arts governance. Its best practice frameworks have changed irrevocably over the last 10 years. And in part, that's been driven by some fantastic work that's come out of the Ontario Nonprofit Network, who launched, this year they launched a fantastic online portal called the Reimagining Governance Hub. And I interviewed them. My latest Arts Governance Revolution article is up now in the latest edition of Meanjin, and I was speaking to the Ontario mob for that piece, and they were talking about the importance of frontrunners. So organisations that do invest in these innovations, in these new ways of doing things, to create case studies and models for the rest of us to follow. So we really need to start seeing the top end of town, the better resourced organisations, the ones with more staff to allocate to these ideas, to just do some thinking and innovating within their own organisations, so that the rest of the sector can follow their lead.
Thanks so much, Kate. That's exciting, and hopefully Emerald, you could pop in that link if you haven't already to the Reimagining Governance Hub, and also Kate's recent article in Meanjin. Okay, so we have another case study to show for you, and this time it is Punctum, a small arts company in Castlemaine in Victoria. So we're going to hear from Jude Anderson, who's the artistic director and founder. So over to.
My name's Jude Anderson, and I'm artistic director and founder of a little arts organisation called Punctum, which is based on Jara country in central Victoria. And Punctum has existed since 2004. We started as a collective working on projects, and then decided to form a not-for-profit incorporated organisation. So we undertake productions and programs that support experimentation in live arts. We are in the process of moving from being a project-based organisation into one that is more focused on an organisation that has capacity to present a year-round program and undertake experiments, evaluation through our productions. What this has meant for us is that we had the great fortune of working with Kate, who is part of this presentation. What Kate opened up for us in our thinking through our strategic plan is that we're a lot freer than we think, and that how we develop a strategic plan can really purposefully be spent on undertaking a foundational document that has a lot of sense that we can use every day in our language. So that meant that we didn't necessarily have to write a vision mission statement, because we are values based and we already had a manifesto. Moving from project based to organizational base meant that we did some really grindy stuff, like going through our rules of association to figure out what really made sense there and what language was useful there. And through that process, as Kate will potentially outline, we discovered that we could be paring back on quite a few things and emphasising a few other things. That understanding of using your own language, saying what you need to say, understanding really the essential of what you do, and then testing it with someone who understands the legislation for not-for-profit organisations, I would say for us has been a really good, healthy process.
Thanks so much to Jude from Punctum for sharing their journey. And just want to also acknowledge those interviews were done by Gurkam Ajaralu, the series producer. And so thank you, Gurkam, for those 3 case studies. Kate, I might turn to ask the audience or to take some of the audience questions now, unless there's something specifically you wanted to follow up about Punctum and your work with them. No? Okay. So we have a really good question from Zora Pang. It says, thanks so much for the insights. It's giving me confidence to what I've been thinking and experience in our sector every day. At the moment, we have an artist-run space in Canberra called Tributary Projects, where the whole board is young, POC, queer, career change people. We also have an advisory board to support us as we are all learning. The roles are termed, so they have them for terms. However, we still feel like we need more guidance and community and network on this front to support us to become more radical. Do you have any recommendations of who, what org to connect with after this talk? Thanks so much.
Look at that wonderfully representative board. I mean, I think the first thing is to just recognise that you are streets ahead of many organisations already. And both the OSCO research and my own has showed that the majority of board members have never been inducted, never received training, and so also don't actually know what their responsibilities are. So even though sometimes we think we might. So don't feel like you're alone in that. It's really exciting to hear this appetite we were just talking about in real life. In terms of advice of where to go next, I think it's important to recognise that we in Australia are at the beginning of this journey. So we don't actually have yet huge amounts of extraordinary new practice, cutting edge practice to draw from. Australia Council are going to be sharing that Reimagining Governance Lab from Ontario that might have some resources. In the Q&A, I've shared some of my own articles and provocations that might be of interest, but a lot of this work is still to be done. In the Mianjin article I mentioned, was the first time I had to call every single state and territory in Australia to get guidance on the minimum number of board members required in each state or territory, which is not publicly available anywhere, and which, let me tell you, differs quite significantly from what they recommend as model rules, but which is different from required rules. So this is all very new. So we're all having this conversation together. We're all making it this evolving what governance means. So hopefully some of those resources will help, but then we look forward to the resources that you create too.
Thanks so much, Kate. And there are 6 of these sessions, and I believe the Australia Council also has I don't believe, but we can put a link into the Australia Council's program for Zora as well that they might be interested in. We have a good question here from Matthew Hall, and I'll throw this one to Cecilia. Are the ACNC governance guidelines currently flexible enough to allow for organisations to create governance frameworks and practices that are more aligned to the cultural groups those organisations represent?
Yeah, I think so. And I have to admit, I probably should have gone back and had a look at them before we started this session. But I think so, yes. I think, and I love the example just then of an inexperienced youth board with an advisory body helping them to govern. That is an absolutely brilliant example. I think so long as you have the required board structure, there is flexibility for you to be able to create advisory structures around it. I know that I'm on the board of something called Yillabara Solutions, which is a not-for-profit Aboriginal employment and training company set up by New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, the Peak Land Council body. And we have in the last 18 months done exactly that. We're keeping to a smaller board. We have set up, we're calling them subcommittees, but we've set up a number of specialist subcommittees, and we're co-opting people, experts onto those subcommittees to help give us the governance grunt that we don't necessarily have completely at the board level. So yes, I think those flexibilities are there so long as you're meeting all of your stock standard requirements for structure and reporting, etc.
Thanks so much, Cecilia. We have 3 minutes left, and I want to thank everyone, but I will just put this comment in and see if either of you would like to respond to it in 30 seconds each, which is, can we adopt an approach of radical unity to this change process? Perpetuating blame, enmity, division between large and small harms us all and makes change infinitely more challenging, and it stops this feeling like a safe space for all of us. And that's a hard one to answer in 30 seconds. I would say that some of those, that kind of, that, what do you call it, division that's been set up that between large and small orgs, or, you know, it's very much like a structural kind of, a structural thing that needs to be tackled. And yeah.
It is. And it comes down to, for me, it comes down to how the funding has been set up, and that there's guaranteed funding for the MPAs and everybody else has to fight for the scraps. And while ever that's the funding regime, I don't think you're going to be able to get beyond those divisions, unfortunately.
Until we really do address the structural inequity at the core of that. But thank you so much.
Can I just can I add to that, just in terms of what we're talking about and some of the commentary a few minutes ago? I think take Bangarra obviously out of the mix when you're talking about the MPAs, but if a lot of those major performing arts organisations, the very traditional arts organisations, didn't have the sort of guaranteed funding that they do have, then they would be moving a lot more quickly to diversify their governance structures, to diversify what they deliver in terms of performance, because they still cling on to pitching to a certain traditional audience, and that they don't have a lot of reason to expand. But I think one day the Australian community will have shifted so significantly, and I'm thinking about the Indian communities and the Chinese communities, that are the two largest growing language groups, cultural groups in the country. One day there will be economic imperative for those MPAs to have to diversify, but I think they will probably be brought kicking and screaming to the table. Okay, there's my undiplomatic piece, Kate.
No, really good radical way to end the conversation. Before I close it, I wanted to include, or we're including a link to a survey. It's really important for us to get your feedback. We've got 5 more of these sessions, and we want to get it right. So please fill it in. It should take you 5 minutes. Also, I really want to thank our wonderful speakers, Cecilia Anthony and Kate Larson, for your valuable knowledge and experience sharing during this session, and to the speakers who also spoke to us as part of the case studies. Thanks so much to the Australia Council and the wonderful team there for leading this project, and particularly Adelaide Reef, Emerald Dunn Frost and Adam McGowan. And of course, a massive thank you and acknowledgement to our series producer, Dr. Gurkam Ajaralu, who is absolutely brilliant and has put this all together. Thanks to our Auslan interpreters, Yasmin Dendachi and Terry Richardson, and to our captioners, our live captioners, Angela Shee and Luke Perry. And importantly, to all of you for your fantastic questions and for joining this conversation. I think that over 200 people RSVP'd, or somewhere around 290. So I'm not sure what the final number is. We're also going to, all of those resources and links that people have put in, it'll either be Australia Council or Diversity Arts will create a page that we can share those many links with you. What an awesome session. Thank you so much, everyone. Fill in the survey. And thanks to the team at Diversity Arts Australia as well.